you're not ever really creating work because you feel like you're amazing at it. You create work because you feel like there's something that you need to get out and you find enjoyment in it. But in order for it to get seen, you have to be confident. So it's a real strange personality that you have to kind of take on and show.
Welcome to the Flying Fruit Bowl, a platform dedicated to discussion and exploration of art and the creative process. I'm the host and creator, RNS, and in this two-part episode, I had the chance to talk to the amazing Ellis King. Ellis is an emerging artist based in the UK who creates paintings of women that explore the concept of the female's role in society. She's recently finished creating a series of 100 faces, which she created in order to find a cohesive visual style and direction in her work. I had a great time talking to Ellis, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation too. Let's start where I start with everybody, which is tell us a bit about yourself and how you became an artist.
So my name is Ellis King, and I'm a contemporary figurative artist based in Norwich, in the UK. And my work is inspired by the experience of being a woman in the 21st century, and specifically looks to explore issues around patriarchy and gender inequality. So I'm pretty new to this industry. I've probably only been painting seriously for about a year. It was a hobby from kind of school days and something that I carried on all the way through my previous work, but wasn't something that I ever considered to be kind of a serious profession of mine. But to kind of tell you the long story, I suppose, I relocated from London back to Norwich in 2018. And soon after that, I had my son, who was actually born premature, so he was 10 weeks early. And for me, that meant a huge difference in what the experience was that I expected to have, just with terms of being pregnant and then being a mother to a young son. But it also meant that the journey that I could go on after that in terms of my career and trying to pick work back up was very difficult, because I had a baby who was effectively 2.5 months younger than what he actually was. So with development and things like that, he just wouldn't have been at the age that he should have been to, say, go to nurseries and things like that, or just for me to have other people look after him. He had quite a few complications. So it meant that I couldn't find work in what I needed, in what my previous profession was. And so I then kind of took a bit of a risk and started producing work, I think, as a bit of a middle finger to the fact that it didn't feel like the system was set up for people who didn't fall into the kind of normal categories. And I think I mentioned to you before that I started creating digital work and selling prints, so just affordable art prints for homes. But then I just wasn't feeling satisfied in terms of what that creative itch was, and started picking up pastels and paints again, and soon realized that that was kind of what the calling was, and invested my time and energy instead in trying to find, I guess, quote unquote, a normal job, into following my passion and painting and creating art, and using the themes, I suppose, of why I'd kind of got to that place and the struggles that I'd found myself up against as the inspiration for the pieces that I was creating. And yeah, I guess now I'm kind of so passionate about it and so gripped by it that I can't really turn back at this point. I think it's kind of I've jumped in and that's it. But yeah.
How amazing that you kind of decided that art is going to be the choice of expression for you to kind of think about and kind of utilize and play around with all these thoughts and emotions you're having. I'm kind of curious, why art though? Why did you think art was the right kind of channel, I guess?
So I created art when I was young, and then kind of continued to do that, like through university and things like that. I'd make pieces for friends and do small bits just to keep that itch scratched, I suppose. And I think there'd always been a desire of mine to try and fall in that space. And for me, it was more that I think there was a bit of a sliding doors moment when I was young as to whether or not I decided to follow what I would call my passion, which is the arts, and, you know, go to art school and see where it led me, or go the academic route. And I was I would call myself within that kind of early feminist generation where I was brought up with the Spice Girls and being told that, you know, girl power and girls can do anything that they want to be. But that also went against slightly the grain of what people were being told at that time, which was also, if you're clever, then university was the direction for you to go in. And I think we definitely saw that boom in terms of the amount of people or young people who then went to university. And I would say that I fell within that time frame and that group. So it's it almost isn't a surprise to me looking back that I now am in the place that I am, because it was always something that was at the back of my mind and something that I felt very, not only passionate about, but it was a form of self-expression. And I think if you're not a particularly confident person, which, like most of the population, I suppose I would class myself as, it's a very easy way for you to try and get those things out in a way. You don't agree? What do you think?
No, that's a really good consideration. I think that's a really good consideration. I've actually never thought about it quite like that, but it makes a lot of sense just from a lot of the people I've spoken to and getting to kind of know them personally and kind of understanding how maybe they might be a little bit more introverted, or they might not be as confident as other people, or they might not be, you know, kind of as outgoing. Like, art is definitely a really interesting way to create discussion and kind of be able to say things without having to actually talk to people. I think that's you know, I think one of the age-old adages of artists are like, you know, if I could say it, I wouldn't need to paint it. But at the same time, it's also interesting because it's like a nice paradox, because people want to talk to you about your work at some point. You're going to have to talk about it at some point, even if you don't want to talk about it. You're going to kind of have to. So it's
no,
kind
you're
of,
absolutely right.
it's very interesting to consider it that way. I don't think I've ever actually thought about it like that in terms of, you know, and I guess that's also what I'm very curious about with anybody who creates any form of art is like, why are people compelled to create art? It's not even just, oh, I want money, but it's like, there's always a deeper meaning for it. There's always a deeper meaning. And I guess that leads into a nice question, actually, which is like, what does being an artist mean to you?
I think that primarily it is a way for me to express something within myself that I didn't actually know that I needed to express. So almost like a form of therapy, I suppose. And I not only does that keep me level, it also means that it's a really hard one. Like, I've thought about this question so many times. Sorry, you're going to have to edit this.
No, honestly, it's all good.
It's a really difficult one, I think, to actually specify what it means. I think that being an artist for me, and probably everyone else, is so many different things all rolled into one, or just separate things, actually. So I guess for me, it is that it's a form of self-expression. It's something that I need to get out, and it's almost something that, like, this week I've not really been able to do any work because childcare has fallen through, and so I'm a full-time mum and can't paint when I'm a full-time mum, and I feel it like gets to a point where I'm itching to get in there. It's something that it's almost slightly addictive, I think. I suppose a little bit like if you were really into exercise and you just get so used to that being your way to kind of clear your head, and it becomes something that you really need in your day. And so that's part of, I think, what it is. But I think also being an artist means trying to share something or create a voice for something that you feel is maybe lacking, or that you feel that you can have an influence with. So, I mean, for my work, it's the same as a lot of other people, and this is a conversation that is, I would say, quite current at the moment around feminism and women's experiences and gender inequality and all those things. So I'm certainly not doing something that's new, but I suppose you just hope that maybe if your one voice is one of many, that hopefully you'll be able to start creating change, or at least raise awareness of something. So it feels a bit like, I don't know, you're protesting something quite silently that maybe will help along the lines. But, and I guess the other points of it, a bit like we were saying before, being an artist actually is like a bit of a personal challenge as well, because if you're not very confident, and as I've got older, I probably, when I was younger, would have said that I was an extrovert, but I'm probably more an introvert than I ever realized I was, which maybe everyone has that conclusion. And like you said, you kind of go into this profession, or start creating work as a silent means to try and get something off your chest. But ultimately, if you want to succeed in it, you have to talk about it. So it's this strange thing. And in talking about it or sharing your work, you completely open yourself up to feedback, criticism. Also, you can have compliments, which are fantastic, but I've realized, having gone from marketing, or a very structured job, into something that's very fluid and creative, that within the arts you get that feedback in a way that you just don't in any other role, it feels, or at least in my previous role. You might not ask someone for feedback or their thoughts on it, and people give it to you, and it's not very complimentary.
For better or for worse.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a learning curve, and it definitely, I think, is, being an artist maybe helps your character in some ways, because you have to learn how to deal with those things as well, which, if you're not exposed to it previously, you definitely have to find a way to I don't know, get a bit of a thicker skin, I suppose, and toughen up.
See, absolutely, because I find like the idea of being an artist very fascinating, because you do open yourself up to criticism. You do, like, from everybody I've spoken to, and I'm probably going to say that a lot because I've spoken to a lot of people at this point. From everyone I've spoken to, particularly exhibiting your work, which we'll get into much later, it's a very vulnerable experience. And I think it's kind of weird how you want to be vulnerable by sharing your work, but you also want to be guided by knowing what your work is about and not necessarily talking about it. It's a nice, interesting paradox. I'm kind of always interested to kind of crack the veneer there and kind of get inside people and understand kind of like, what is it they're actually trying to do with the work they're creating? Because, sometimes it's just nice to be asked. Like, my philosophy with everything I do with the Flying Fruit Bowl is, I like asking artists about their work because it's nice to be asked. Like, it's nice for somebody to take their time to stop and not just say to you, "Oh, I like your work," but to say to you, "Oh, I like your work. Let's talk about it." Because there might be a lot you want to say, you just have never had the chance to say it. That's at least that's what I'm trying to do.
No, I think it's a really good point, and actually, I think that how we all communicate with each other these days is very transactional. If you, as an example, you take social media, it's a tool in itself that you like a few of someone's posts and you comment with a motivation to get somewhere. It doesn't always feel like a very authentic platform, I would say. And you don't, you might get something where someone just says, "Oh, I like it," or actually like the post. You don't necessarily get the opportunity to go into much detail about your work. So I think having platforms like this, and even just being asked to do it, like I said to you before, like it's, as someone who's very new to this, it's a real, not only is it a confidence booster, which I think anyone in the arts definitely needs, it also just, it's really nice having that place to be able to discuss it a bit more. And obviously, if you're creating work with a narrative, then it helps to share that as well. So you're ticking two boxes, I suppose.
I appreciate that. I just think it's nice to give people a chance to speak and to have a platform where people can, I've wrote about this in my stories of the day, where they can kind of engage and be inspired and, be acknowledged, because I think that's important. End of the day, like artists work so damn hard. It's unreal. Like the amount of hard work that goes into being an artist is insane. Yet we just see the final image on Instagram, which we just scroll past, and I think that's honestly a travesty, because it's like, that's somebody's life they put into that. It's not even just like they just thought about it for 5 minutes. It's like time, effort, materials, money, and you just scroll past it. So I don't know. That's just my opinion about art. I like art, clearly. So anyway, let's talk about you and your work rather than me and my opinions, because that's not what we're here for. So what is the biggest challenge of being an artist so far?
So I think my biggest challenge so far is probably getting work seen. So I think when you're new to the industry, you rely quite, I think we've spoken about it, you rely very heavily on social media, and actually there's a lot of eyeballs there, but it is so quick that you have to make that impression to someone, and you're competing with probably millions of other artists out there. And if you don't feel very confident in using the tool, then it's really, really hard. And I think it's such a competitive space anyway, trying to, have your piece seen by someone. If you think of galleries, for someone to choose your work as opposed to someone else's, it can be really tough. And I know that I've listened to one of your other podcasts with an artist, and you were talking about, admin takes up a lot of time.
Yes.
When you're an artist, it's not just about producing the work. It's about, in order to try and get your work seen, you are applying and applying and applying. It's a job in itself, just going through that process. And there's a lot of people doing it, and there's a lot of amazing artists. So actually trying to break through that and get that one shot that could be enough to, catapult your career, doesn't come that easily. So you have to be resilient and patient, and just kind of try and keep that self-belief that maybe at some point it will all pan out, and almost not let that lose sight of why you're doing what you're doing. It can be, I think, quite easy to think, oh, well, it's not working, so there's no point me doing it, rather than realizing that you're doing it because you have to do it. Like there's something in you that feels like you need to do this for yourself, or that you're getting something so fulfilling out of it that you need to carry on with it. And that maybe necessarily the financial benefits, whilst would be very nice, aren't always the crux of it, I suppose.
See, I 100% agree with that. And actually, I have a very good friend who's a really cool photographer who I'm going to send that audio clip to, because he needs to hear that from somebody other than me, if you don't mind.
No, of course.
Because I think that's the thing. I think it goes back to something you said earlier that we're going to get into later with social media, but it definitely comes back into this kind of way that, like, what we see versus reality are two very different things. Like, we see artists being successful, we see them selling NFTs for millions of pounds, and we think, oh, I'm going to do that. And then you realize when you do it, it's not that easy. Things don't work out that way. And it's something I say to a lot of people is that you can't follow somebody else's dream. You have to realize that everything we see is what other people are doing, not what you're going to be doing. And your life doesn't align with anybody else's.
Yeah.
So you have to remember that, yes, well, it's great to see like a really cool artist and be like, oh, I want to be like them. There's nothing wrong with that. You have to remember your journey is always going to be different, because their resources, their opportunities, their finances are going to be different to yours. They might have opportunities that you'll never have. They may never have opportunities that you might have. So you just have to remember that, like, no matter what, you are on your own path, as much as it might not seem like it, you really truly are. Because if you're looking at everybody else's careers and being like, oh, well, they've got these opportunities, why don't I? you're not obviously then making more time for you and yourself and your own work. I think you're,
Mm,
it's good to look at other people. It's good to be motivated, and it's good to be inspired by what other people are doing. But action is more important than anything else. Particularly for artists, like time is, limited. You don't have all the time in the
mm,
world. You think you have the time, but you always don't. So yeah, you have to just kind of
yeah.
act and do stuff and just try the best you can. It's like the amount of people who tell me that they don't like they're not sure how to market their work. So I'm like, so why don't you ask me for a feature, because you'll know how to feature your work tomorrow. It's like, so I say to them, okay, so how many places have you reached out to, for features for different websites? Like, have you looked at any websites for feature your work to get more eyes on it? And they're like, no. And it's like, well, that's one of the easiest ways you can do it. There are places and opportunities. You just have to do the research. And I think sometimes people don't
Mm,
really do the research for what they actually want to do. Because, I'm sorry, there's a slight ramble, but like posting on social media on Instagram is good. Nothing wrong with that. But that's only going to get you so far, because that's only one
mm.
platform. There's only one place people are looking. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you've said. I think it's that the dreaded comparison, which we all do in everyday life, whether that be careers or, personal life. Everyone's comparing everyone else, aren't they?
Yes.
And that can be a great thing in terms of giving you the boost that you need to drive yourself forward, or actually maybe take a plunge that you need to take. But it can also really hinder you. And I think as well, like, you can, to go back to what you were saying around, you sometimes just that you haven't looked in the right places for things, or you haven't thought to do those things that maybe could help. And I think it can be a really overwhelming place, and it can be really difficult when you're starting out to actually know where the best places are to start with those types of things. People are either doing fantastically well by the looks of things, or you're not hearing about them. So
Yeah.
trying to navigate that space, or know where either you fall on it or how to improve in certain areas, I think almost the fact that there are so many people out there kind of doing it, or at least seemingly to be doing it so well, kind of makes it hard to know where to step into, I think.
And how did you step into it, I guess? So like, kind of like, where did you go for resources, being, such a new artist?
I just started like I just started painting. I think that I use a lot of online resources. So I use, in terms of the actual creation of art and the resources I use for that, I use a lot of online resources. So there's websites set up that offer stock images and photographs for you to use,
Yes.
that you can then, use as your inspiration in whatever way
Yeah.
that you might want to, which are fantastic. Or just photographs, almost going back to what I remember doing at school, which is collaging a lot of things and then painting it. Like,
That's so cool.
but then in terms of resource for trying to get stuff out there, I probably have made quite a lot of mistakes, which wouldn't be a bad thing for people in the early stages to know of. So when I started with the digital work, so the digital work and the artist, I would not, sorry, they're both artwork, but the digital work and the actual painting, I would call two almost completely separate industries in a way. How I first tried to get into the digital stuff was, the same as everyone, Instagram, website, try and get friends and family involved and promoting it through their channels. And then doing a lot of outreach to influencers to try and, who have got home accounts, to try and get them to put pieces on their wall and post about them. And then I spent some money on some ad search marketing, and that was not a good thing for me to do, because and I think that's the thing, when you're so new to it, you just don't really know where to start. And I come from a marketing background, which is very much, it was in fundraising. So it was
Well, okay.
The channels are very well established, and they are the routes that you would go in terms of digital advertising. They're the ones that you would go down. But of course, little old me here producing a few pieces is never going to get the traction that you need, or the search. So I think you can panic do things, which is definitely what I did. I wanted to try and get things bought and create some money to support my family, and that just didn't really work. And then I think when I realized, okay, it's not going to work that way, and I just do not feel fulfilled, you need to go back to basics and paint, and just and actually since that, in terms of the resources I use, I've been fairly slow, I think, in terms of utilizing stuff, because I really want to feel comfortable in the work that I'm creating, so that when people like you ask me, that I know what it is that I'm doing and why I'm doing it, as opposed to creating something because either I want to be financially rewarded, or I don't know, I need something to be able to say properly to people. I think I realize that I need to be confident in what it is that I'm doing. And so, yeah, at this point, it's been actually the resources of more recently have been trying to reach out to galleries and exhibitions and see if I can get work seen in those places, and taking opportunities like this when they arise to try and get a bit of my voice out there.
Yeah, because I think your presence is important. And I think definitely the idea of reaching out to galleries, I think that's actually something I need to look more into in terms of finding resources for that, because I think a lot of people I know really want to exhibit work, they just don't know how to do that. So now I've just now said that, I'm like, actually, I might Google that later and have a bit of look at some links. There's a really cool artist I'm going to send you. Okay. Oh, also, I should have said, I have a really bad habit of sending people I speak to a ton of artists, and
I love it.
I try and keep up. I try and keep up with everybody, which is getting harder and harder. It really is getting harder and harder. I'm not actually a big, as you said earlier, like I'm not extroverted in any way. I'm actually really introverted. So for me to be keeping up with this many people at once is so weird. It's so busy. It's not even stressful. It's just weird. It's like I never would have imagined my life would have been like this. It's so weird. Like me 2 years ago was literally just like not talking to anybody. Me now is like just sending people like video messages. Like why the hell am I doing that nowadays? It's so weird, but it's great. No, it's great. It's great for me personally, which is amazing. But it's just so weird. It's just so different. But anyways, as I was saying, because I've literally just rumbled on. There's an artist called Calvin Lai, who I spoke to a while ago. But at the minute, he's creating these really interesting reels that are like really cool content. So it's stuff like how to package prints, how to paint, how to mix black, stuff like that. Like really kind of quote unquote simple things, but things that I really feel like artists should really know. So I'm going to send him. I'm going to send them over to you later. I've wrote his name down.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
But yes,
it's a really interesting thing, actually, like just that he's doing those things, because I think they are the simple things that actually you don't, if you're starting out, you don't, where do you start?
Yeah, it's like how do you package your print? Like, I mean, it's like
send your artwork, like how do you send it without it being damaged? How do you send it in an affordable way? How do you, like, there's a lot of underlying questions and I think considerations that you have to make when you try and enter into this field that maybe you're not aware of before. And it's great that people are creating resource, I think, to understand those things to help.
So before I ask the next question, I want to quickly say, so what I'll end up doing is I'll end up sending you like a bunch of artists, of people who I think you might like, or who I think your work is nicely aligned with, because I already have quite a few suggestions for you, because your art has a very particular aesthetic that I really like personally.
Thank you.
So, which is why when I saw it, I was like, oh, this is really interesting. Because
I love getting people's artwork, like, and being able to like see what other people are doing. I find it incredibly inspiring.
But what I'm going to do first off though is I'll send you some people that I've spoken to, so I would highly advise you to reach out to connect with them, because if there's one thing I love to see is when people I speak to connect with each other. I think that's the best thing ever, and that happens quite often, so it's good. So it's nice. It means I'm actually doing something right, which is perfect. But yeah, there's quite a lot of people I can send you actually, because I'm just thinking there's quite a like interesting portraiture, kind of identity, faces, the idea of kind of absence and presence in the portrait. Like there's so many things there that I can think off the top of my head that you might like. So I'll send you a ton of stuff later, which is going to be fun for your inbox. Let's say that.
No, I love it. I can't wait.
So my next question for you is kind of based off what you've just said about kind of resources, and it's kind of the idea of like, so what kind of hats do you have to wear as an artist that you were kind of surprised by?
I think that when you first become an artist, so firstly, I think actually there's some kind of transition where you create art, and at a point you then identify as an artist. And I guess that kind of comes where you get to that point where actually we were saying, if you sell things, then that's fantastic. But actually that you feel like you need to be there and you need to be creating something. And you might have a day where, why have I just spent 12 hours doing this? And that happens quite often, but you still get in there the next day and you carry on. So I think there's that hat is probably as I expected it would be, in terms of, you know, creating the work and being lost in the paints and the canvas. But then there are other hats that I didn't really, I probably was just really naive to it and hadn't really researched properly or taken the time to consider it, because I think if you feel compelled to do something, you kind of do it and then worry about it later. But as we were saying before, things like, you know, your social medias, you're almost, I think there's a challenge between creating what feels like a brand for yourself versus being your authentic self and showing your work and just being who you are. And I think at some point you choose which side of that you're going to be on. So I think that's a hat that, whilst I knew I would have to do, I probably didn't expect it to have maybe some of the challenges that it does have. And alongside that, you're your own PR. So you're having to be the voice for your work and to try and reach out to people and to get people to look at your stuff. Which again, I think is something that you know that you have to do, but when you're actually doing it, it feels quite different. It feels like going for job interviews, constantly telling everyone that you're amazing at what you do. And if you're not ever really creating work because you feel like you're amazing at it. You create work because you feel like there's something that you need to get out and you find enjoyment in it. So, but in order for it to get seen, you have to be confident and you have to sell that side of you. So it's a real strange personality that you have to kind of take on and show. So yeah, I think there's a few. It definitely has. It's a business in a sense. Like when you try and start to get stuff out there, you're your own little business, and ironically, you might be a business not making any money, but you're trying to be seen, or feel like you're doing something to be able to continue to buy the paints that are expensive and the canvas or board which is expensive, or look for other routes around it. So it definitely isn't as clear cut, I think, as you think that when you first go into being an artist, in terms of the roles that you have to take.
So do you think that, just based off what you just said, it's a question I was going to post on an Instagram story the other day, but I feel like I posted something similar, but I'm just now thinking about recently, do you think that marketing your work is perhaps more important than the work itself?
Yes and no. I think that you don't want your work to be influenced by the marketing. If you're an artist creating it for something that's inside you, I think if you want to create work, and I'm sure there are some artists out there that are, they want to create work in order to sell, in order to support their family, support their lives, and they're able to do that. But there are also the other category of artists, which probably are the ones that we're more traditionally hear of, that are the struggling artists that don't really make it until they're dead. And I think for those people, there is the risk that by marketing your work in the ways that you need to, you can be influenced by that and by other people marketing their work and what you see. And rather than kind of staying focused on what it is that you're doing, it can get a little bit muddy.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a fair assessment, but equally, you're never going to sell anything if you're just creating work in your house and you're not going out to galleries or trying to speak to people or speaking to other artists to see what they are doing. So it's hard, isn't it? And again, to go back to what we said before, you see so many people who are seemingly absolutely smashing it because their Instagrams are great and every post has sold. And then there's the other side of it where there are tons of incredibly successful artists who aren't on that platform that are also doing well, and they're just using traditional means of marketing. So it almost, I think, is that there are two types of marketing, and social media as a marketing tool, I think, has overtaken in probably how we see things to work, or just our exposure to it is way more than the other means that also work very well.
Right. I think we are going to talk about your work. Otherwise, we'll talk about social media for like the next hour. Because I was going to ask you the question about social media, and I was like, wait, we have a whole section on this later. Let's get into your work, because what we're here to talk about. I was just thinking, that's a really good consideration in terms of like, like there's like two different aspects of social media, or there's different like routes you can go down. But we'll talk about that later. But okay, let's get into your work, because I feel like we've spoken ages of everything around your work other than your work. So can you just describe your work for those who may not have seen it?
Yeah. So probably like a really, really basic way of describing my work is like sad paintings of women. But a way more sophisticated term would probably be that they are, so my work are portraits, painted portraits, mainly in acrylics or mixed medias. And I focus on women because that's kind of the theme of what got me to this place, in terms of my own life experience and I guess what I want to put out into the world. Not to say that don't paint men, but just I think what the series and the narrative that I'm in at the moment, that kind of is my focus, and that may well change. But my work is often infused with bold strokes of color. So they could be kind of slashes of paint across eyes or bold blocks of color. And it's kind of what you said earlier, there's a lot of kind of absence of space or the presence of something. And that has manifested more as a representation, I think, of what the lived experience of a woman is compared to, I would say, what the gendered narrative is. And I say all of this knowing full well that these types of topics can be very hit or miss with people. I think it's a controversial topic still to talk about. But I think that for a lot of women who almost have been in a place where you can self-reflect on your experiences, and I think it happens more as well when you're a parent, and then you have that whole new experience of being a woman and trying to work and navigate, childcare and employment and all those other things. It means that the work that I produce is mainly based around those themes in some way. And I don't think I knew that when I first started, that perhaps the work that I was creating had that specific theme to it. But more now, as I reflect and have gone on a journey with it, I understand that is if I have conversations about my experience as a woman, that is what comes out. So I think that naturally then manifests in the work that I produce.
So I think you said sad paintings. I think that's a really I would never have I wouldn't actually have called your work sad. I don't think sad is the way I would have described it. So I think that's a very interesting way for you to describe your work, your own work as well.
Well, do you know why actually that I more say that is that I have had a lot of feedback that people interpret it as being sad. So when I produce it, I'm not actually producing it thinking that that is the emotion of the person in the painting. But where there's been a lot of people comment on it, I can only assume that that is actually what is actually coming out of me into that space. Because I think that a lot of the time when you create something, you might not actually know what there is inside of you that is kind of raring and feeding itself
Absolutely.
into the piece. And it can only sometimes it could be 6 months later I look at something and the time that I was in at that point and think, oh, that does make a lot of sense, but you might not have even known it at the time. So I mean, I don't create a lot of happy faces, I would say that.
Just thinking about your work, I would say there's a kind of sense of longing in your work. Like maybe the women are
Yeah,
longing for a
yeah,
better
you're
life,
probably
you know.
you're probably right that that is, yeah, yeah,
I'm
that's
sure they
probably more accurate.
I'm just trying to think of like thinking about your work in my mind's eye. I'm just like, well, what do I get from the work? Like, why am I intrigued by that work? Because, you know,
Mm,
I guess the conversation you're having may not necessarily be the conversations I would think you're having or I would necessarily get out of your
mm,
work. And I also really like personally your technique as well, which really fascinates me in terms of like the way you paint. Like, because, yeah, I'll ask you this question now rather than later. I forget the order that I always have that and never goes to plan. Um, because your work is not realistic, but it's also not abstract. It sits in that really, really, really interesting middle ground between being,
mm,
you know, it's not photorealistic. You're not there to portray, you know, a mirror image of the world, but at the same time, it's a person, it's a human.
yeah,
You can tell. Could you talk a bit about the idea of like realism in your work and kind of how important is that to you?
yeah. In terms of realism of the portrait
Yes,
itself,
of course.
yeah. So it's, I think we all have, when you paint, you have a style, and I think you can spend, you might have an idealistic view of how you want your work to look. And I look at paint at artists who paint realistic portraits, as in, I would say more fine art, and think it's absolutely incredible and wish I could do it. And could spend a lifetime trying to get to that point and never actually reach it. And so I think part of the journey that I've gone on is definitely then kind of finding a piece with the style that I have, which isn't realistic, isn't realism, but as you said, it forms somewhere in between that realism and abstract space, I would say. You know, if you look at one of the paintings, most of the time, you know that they're women, and the proportion sizes are accurate and all of those types of things. But I try and bring in elements um, of the abstract, I suppose, quite intentionally, and then unintentionally they come in as well, just because of the style that I have. Um, and I think that as an artist, it's kind of just about embracing that and seeing where it goes and where it evolves, and with each piece kind of maybe pushing those things and having confidence to say, okay, well, I'm just going to let it go and see where it goes, and be a bit more fluid with this aspect of it and maybe a bit more rigid with other aspects of it. And as you create different series and explore different themes within those series, I think they naturally change as you move through that.
There was an artist I spoke to called Mark Thompson, and we spoke about this idea between being the abstract and the real, and he called it the netherworld.
Oh,
And
I
it's this
like
idea
that.
that it's its own kind of reality that's not quite real, it's not quite abstract, it's somewhere else in between. And
Yeah,
I absolutely love that. I think it's the best thing ever. And every single time I see an image like that, I think of him. So
that's
it's this
such a
idea.
That's a great idea. Yeah,
It's
I
this
love
idea
that.
that between the abstract and the real is its own reality, and all your work exists on that plane. Um, I don't know. It's just something about that kind of style that I honestly just really love, and I'm really interested in. So I have so many people to send you that are going to be really interesting. Um, but I'm also kind of curious about the abstract nature to your work, because it almost feels like you're redefining the female form, or redefining the female portrait, and redefining kind of what it is to be a female, and the kind of, I guess, rather kind of, whether you want to or not, like looking at standards of beauty, for instance. I think it's kind of that type of conversation, no matter what you do, is going to come up, I guess.
Yeah.
And kind of like, how often do you think about I guess kind of like the beauty standards in your work, or the way, or presenting like an image that is traditionally acceptable, I guess.
Mm. I don't really think about it, if I'm entirely honest. I will create something and I will think, it's almost like that question of knowing when to stop. It just feels done, or it feels right, and so you either stop painting, or you feel like the piece has reached a natural conclusion. And the element of whether or not the subject is beautiful, it's not something I ever consider. And the reason I don't consider it is because men and women have such different ideas about what beauty is. And I don't think that you can ever get there. And I find it so much more interesting to try and capture what it means to be a woman, in terms of, I mean, we're all so flawed, men and women, we're all flawed. And we see I don't know, 0.2% of what it is to be beautiful on our, in media.
Yeah.
And it's not real. I've got friends who are absolutely stunning, and all of my friends are all so different, but they're all beautiful in their own way. The same with, all of the women I know. So I think the importance for me is way less about beauty and way more about trying to capture something that is, I suppose, authentic, or at least my idea of authentic, and that tries to show that this idea of beauty just is unsustainable, and it's just not something that we can ever achieve. And perhaps that's also part of why my work is somewhere in that netherworld, as you said, which I love. Because at the moment, we don't really see that world. We only see what we're exposed to, which generally is airbrushing and all the rest of it. We don't see what it means to be a man or a woman in the everyday. And we all have also our own opinions of what that is. So I suppose my work falls somewhere between our own opinions of it, what we're exposed to, and kind of falls in there somewhere.
Yeah, that's nice. I like that. I just think there's something very fascinating about the way that you're capturing these images, where you're creating these images, and you're very kind of boldly being like, well, this is what I want to do, as opposed to being like, oh, it has to be done in quote unquote this traditional way, or, oh, these women need to look this certain way. And I'm actually just really curious, as you can imagine, it's going to come up, because it always comes up in any kind of situation where women are being painted, but the idea of like the male gaze and how that relates to your work.
Yeah, I think a lot of actually the work that I create is this idea of the juxtaposition of trying to portray yourself in the way that you feel like you're meant to be seen by the male gaze, versus the way that you actually are seen, or the way that you see yourself. And part of that is also the elements of camouflage, and that, part of us tries to kind of fall into that, but there's always a part of us that's missing or not quite there. The male gaze is such an interesting conversation, because I don't think that it's something that we really realize until we actually step back and think about it in that very, very detailed sense. And even people's interpretations of my work and what they comment on, I think shows exactly how that male gaze has affected how we see things. You know, I've painted things and had comments that, oh, she's not quite beautiful enough, you know, whether it be that a nose isn't quite right or something like that, because someone might want that very beautiful, like you said before, realistic portrait of someone. And of course, it just shows how it manifests into all of our thinking. And so I try to create pieces that I think at least bring that more into light, because they're not quote unquote beautiful, and they're not realistic, and try and capture that more as well in these abstract shapes and colors and things like that, which actually I think are a little bit unsettling or look a bit out of place. And I think that's also part of why I put them in there, is to make you step back a little bit and maybe have these wider considerations around what it is that I'm trying to say.
Yes, unsettling is the perfect word to describe your work. That's exactly what it is. Because you look at it and you're not quite sure about what it is you're meant to be looking at, or why you're looking at, or kind of like, yeah, like you kind of look at it and you're like, okay, so what was the intention of the artist? Because I think that's something that I ask myself a lot when I look at work, is kind of like, what is the intention of the artist? And I must say, your biography was very, very, very interesting. And that is a reason, well, I think that's probably 90% of the reason that I want to interview people, is because their biographies are good. Because it shows to me that you have an idea what your work is about. You kind of know what you're doing, or at least it seems like you know what you're doing. And it
the
seems
key to
like,
any artist, seeming to know what you're doing.
Fake it to make it. It's a true thing, trust me.
Yeah.
But like, it's kind of interesting for me to see your work and be like, hey, that's cool. You know, I wonder what that's about. But to actually read what it's about, and or to at least read your opinions of what you think it's about as the creator, I'm always fascinated by that. And I think it's just, it's interesting to consider that you're doing it from a place of opening up the discussion and the discourse around a certain topic, as opposed to just, you know, oh, I'm going to create these women that aren't quite perfect just to get people's attention, to make it about just that. Because it's not just about that, it's about many things. It's about an experience. And I think that's actually a really noble thing to do, as opposed to not. Because, you know, you could create work that is deliberately provocative, you can create work that is deliberately ridiculously terrible, you know, just to get reaction. You could. And people do that, and people have done that, and people still do that. But it's like, no, you chose to be like, okay, cool, I'm going to create these images of these women, but I'm going to create it in the way that I want to create it, with this, to say the things that I want to say. And I don't care if people like it, I don't care if people think they're beautiful, I don't care if people think they're right. It's like, it's what's right to you is what is important, and I really respect that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that it is that difficult space between realizing that you can't really create work that other people like. If you want to do something long term, my intention is that I'll still be painting when I'm 70. And I think the only way that you can do that and sustain that and continue to find joy and relief in what you're doing is to paint things that actually have a meaning to you. And I think the meaning of that comes out in how you paint. I think the two are so intertwined that maybe you don't initially realize it until you really consider what it is that you're painting and why that is.
So why have you decided to focus on portraiture?
In the most simplistic way, I just love faces. I love how everyone's faces are so different. I love the challenge of painting a face, to get proportions right and all those other things. It can be really difficult. You can paint something for 3 days and then think, God, there's something not right here. And you have to go back and try and figure it out. So I like the challenge of it. I think it makes I feel like it makes me a better artist to try and get it right. But also I think that I focus on faces because there's so much that can be said in a portrait that maybe can't be said in other ways. And I think people draw so many conclusions about a face and a portrait that you either didn't intend or that wasn't the emotion that you were trying to get out, as we spoke about before, and the feedback I've had about them looking quite sad. That might not be your intention, but that people are interpreting it in really different ways. And I think as well, seeing the work of other artists and how that their style or their series have all adapted in the portraiture space, I find so fascinating, and I think has been a massive inspiration in terms of kind of starting in this place and hoping to see my work move through the time and through the different experiences that I have. The hardest thing about it is actually trying to either have people sit or take photos for you to be able to use, or finding the materials that actually convey what it is that you're looking for. That's a challenge, because if I was to create something, what I would call abstract, you don't necessarily need those things. Everything's in your head. Whereas I'm at a place where I rely on references, whether that be portraits or photographs or what it is. I need that to feel connected to either the person or the painting. So I suppose as well, the reason I focus on portraiture is I like thinking about each piece as its own narrative and its own little mini story, I think. And painting a portrait, I think, means that in your head you can create a whole backstory for that person. It is almost like creating a novel for each one, I think.
Yes, it's like each image becomes a character in a wider story.
Yeah, I think so. I think, and I think each one is integral to the next one.
I think that do they all exist in the same universe?
At the moment they all do.
That's a great answer.
Yeah, but I think that naturally, maybe as the stories progress, maybe they won't. I don't know.
So that actually is very nice into my next question, which is, what does painting capture that a photograph doesn't?
As a photographer, you might hate this answer, but I think that painting for me captures something about myself in the work. And I know as a photographer equally, how you align something, the lighting that you use, all of those things also do. But I could make a decision to paint a stripe the whole way across a painting. And I think, and that could completely disarray the piece, or it could completely make it. And I think there's the progression of it that I think I love, that a piece that could just go on and on and on. You could pick a piece up that you feel is finished and turn it into something completely different. So I think there's a painting captures a timelessness, perhaps, that a photograph doesn't, that it could, maybe there's never a real end point to it, because as finished as one is, I could still look to change it in, 10 years time if I wanted to.
That is such a good consideration. I've never thought about that, but you're so right as well. Like it's almost never ending, because there's something else you can add to it. Whereas with a photograph, as soon as that picture is taken, it's taken. Like you've captured that moment in time. Whereas with the painting, it's like, it's in a sense, it has its own life.
Yeah.
Because, it goes through transitional changes. Like that's very, very, very interesting. I've never thought of it like that. But
yeah. And I think that's also why, as two different art forms, they're both so great in their own spaces, because on the flip side, the wonderful thing about a photograph is that it captures exactly that space and that time that you want to capture. So yeah, I like for a lot of my stuff, like there are so many of my works that have paintings underneath them where I've painted something and then I'll go back and think, oh, I don't like it, and I'll just paint straight over it and start doing something else. So I think that I like that about it, that there's a story within a story, and that story could just keep going on and on and on.
That is so cool. Like but imagine if you painted something you didn't like and somebody wanted to buy it and they just painted over that by accident, and you're like, oh crap, I painted over that. Then again, they'll just probably buy the new piece because it'll be quote unquote better, I guess. I mean, then again, I guess that's kind of interesting, because that means that you as an artist, you really have to decide what's good, quote unquote good, and what's quote unquote bad, or what's quote unquote, worthy of being existing in the world, as opposed to just being painted over.
Yeah, I think there's a balance between something looking lifelike, in the sense that, like I said to you, that like in the most basic term, like proportions are accurate and things like that. It's really interesting though. I've been doing some self-portraits recently, and it's fascinating to see how they all look so different. Yeah. And I obviously it's just me painting them. It's not like my style or my hand has changed, but you bring something different to each interpretation of yourself. And I guess that is just what happens with other paintings of people that I do. So
I wonder, in your self-portraits, are you more or less critical of yourself whilst painting them?
Less.
That's really interesting. That's very interesting. Because you might consider you'd probably be more, because you have the option to control how you look at the end.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what you said about how we see beauty, I think. And I think all of us are very self-critical of ourselves in our own 100%. Beauty, man or woman. I think we're all very critical. And so I think almost because of that, when you paint yourself, your mirror image of yourself isn't flattering. So actually, it doesn't really make any difference how that comes out, at least in how I perceive it and how I've approached it before. If I saw myself as incredibly beautiful and I painted something, it would never live up to the expectation. But I think true. because I don't see myself in that way, it's so much easier to create something and to, I don't know, for it to almost capture a character, or
then you become a character in the work, then yourself. Yeah,
exactly.
I've shot self-portraits in the past, and I probably still will at some point. So yeah, I know exactly the kind of, it's the idea of like, it's your likeness, but it's not necessarily you. It's kind of like a weird, it's some kind of weird kind of, it's some kind of weird alternative space where it's you. Yeah, it's a self-portrait, but it's not necessarily yourself. It's just likeness.
And I guess that also goes back to a lot of the conversations, doesn't it, around the fact that we're all so many different people, you know, whether that be that we have to adopt different characteristics for work or home, or
absolutely,
you know, we put lots of different hats on, and I suppose as an artist, that's also part of what you capture.
That's so interesting. I feel like I should talk to more artists who do portraits. I've always been interested in the idea of the self and the idea of identity. Which I know are quite broad, very vague, broad topics, but I don't know, there's something about it that I find very fascinating to discuss with people, because I think it opens up people a lot, because everyone has their own opinions about themselves or about identity or about the way they feel about other people and things. And I think one of the great things about art is that it enables us to have such good conversations and such kind of wide-ranging conversations. It's not just oh, I like this image, it's cool, yeah, that's great. You know, it's more like, you know, you kind of get into really deeper discussions from my experiences so far, at least, and getting to talk to people in real life as well. You know, it's easy to sit down and talk to an artist for 2-3 hours, even though my work colleagues are like, how the hell do you talk for that long? And it's just like, it's not hard, because everybody has something to say. You have to just find that one thing you're going to connect with, and that's going to get you into that person's kind of mindset. And then from there, you just understand the person and go from there and build a friendship.
Yeah, you're so right. There's something so personal about creating
Yes.
art in whatever space that is, whether it's painting, portraiture or photography. You're putting something of yourself out there, whether that be, your interpretation of the world and your skill. It's a little bit of yourself out there every time. And I think it really allows you to create with other people who are allowing themselves to be vulnerable like that. And I think that is a shared space that you don't often see.
Absolutely. I think it's not always a space you get to, as I've said previously, get to explore and talk about necessarily. If you exist solely online, if you exist in a space where you're not talking to a lot of artists, or maybe you're not sure how to reach out to a lot of artists, which is something I very much see quite a lot. Because, I think everybody wants to talk about their work, or everybody wants to build a community. But it's hard to actually do that because, there's a fear of being judged. There's a fear of kind of feeling like you're not, the whole imposter syndrome is real, feeling like, you're not really good at what you do, or you're not sure of your own intentions, which is definitely something I think of nowadays.
Yeah.
It's kind of like,
and also,
yeah, sorry,
no, sorry, carry on.
No, continue.
No, I was going to say as well, and also like knowing when you can categorize yourself as an artist.
Yes.
I think that makes it very difficult, as you were saying about imposter syndrome, to know when you fall in that space.
And when would you say you do fall in that space?
I think you fall into the space when you're doing it out of a deep-rooted need to do something, or a desire to do something, where, like, as you do and as I do, you're creating work and you're perhaps spending money and you're not seeing that money come back, but you're doing it because you feel like you love it. Yeah. And you could, rather than you structure your day when you can around it being like a job. When I have so I look after my son. My son goes into childcare for 3 days a week, and then the rest I look after him full time. And so I have to structure that time where I don't have him. I structure it like a job. And I remember, I'm sure you won't mind me saying this, but having conversations with my husband and him being like, you put too much pressure on yourself. Like, just don't worry about it. You have a lay in if you're tired on those days. And it's like, I can't do that. I need to get up, get in there, have that full day. Or if I haven't had that time, I'll go in there of an evening and do it. It's both a need, I think, and also recognizing it as a job and not necessarily just something that you're doing because you really, really enjoy it. You're trying to do something with it.
See, I 100% agree with that. And I think that's actually really valuable advice, because I think one of the biggest problems I've seen so far, particularly with a lot of photographers I know, who are not necessarily making any money from what they do, but they're putting a lot of money into what they do. And it's kind of like, you have to remember that it's an investment. And you have to remember that, like, you're right. You have to not put so much pressure on yourself, because it will get to you. You'll crack, because it's not, there's a fine line between being successful because you're doing a lot of work and just working and just overworking yourself, And I think you very much sound like how I do stuff, whereas in, like, when I have a day off or when I come back home from work, my actual job, I know I'm going to spend 2, 3, 4 hours doing stuff for the Flying Fruit Bowl. My days off, for me, like, my 2 days off are like 12-hour days to do stuff for the Flying Fruit Bowl, because I want to do that. Like, I'd rather do that than sit around watching Netflix, because, like, that's to me, that doesn't really make sense, weirdly. But
maybe that is, though, how it is to be an artist. Maybe that is the common thread, that in order to make it as an artist, or whatever you want to say about it, to feel like you're establishing yourself, your style, getting your work out there, you have to work hard. Like, it is.
You do.
And even people, like you said before, you might see people on Instagram and the first comment is, oh, someone could do that. That looks so easy. But it isn't. If those people are out there and they've got 30,000 followers, and they're selling their work for, I don't know, 400, 500 pounds each, and they're selling them regularly, and they've got them in different places. They are doing something right, and they are working hard at it. Like, it might not be your style, but you can't ever criticize people who have done well for being of a lack of talent. They are very talented, for sure.
So that makes me think of a very, very cool artist I know, and I'm probably going to expose her now by telling you this, which is funny. Her name's Riona Bathello. I actually brought a print of her work, yes, well, the other day, and it arrived yesterday, so it's now hanging up framed, perfect.
Oh, lovely.
But she has about, I think at the minute, like 40,000 followers on Instagram. But she went viral on TikTok a while back because she creates these really, really gorgeous, quite realistic paintings of rainy streets, foggy streets at night. Her work is gorgeous, and she's such a lovely person. She's from Manchester. She's just great. Her accent is perfect. It's just hilarious. I'm like, oh yeah, from Manchester. But she went viral on TikTok, and she sells her work for a ridiculously low price. And I'm talking like so unbelievably cheap. But it's kind of interesting to see kind of the value she has of her own work, because she has the audience. And I've said to her plenty of times, you have the audience to raise your prices significantly, and you'll still be making the money you're making. Obviously, you'll be making more money. You have the option to do that because you're in a position where you have the audience for that. But she doesn't want to, which is cool because she's comfortable where she's at. And I respect that. And I think you have to also think about, as an artist, what value you hold for yourself, because you can be like, oh, I want to make, £50,000 for my art this year. But it's like, do you personally think that your art is worth that? It's like you have to place your own value on what you think your art is worth. And like, how do you go about deciding that?
Oh, that is such a hard question. And I think it's almost harder for me to answer that because I'm so early into this journey, and probably what many would call an amateur artist. But I think it is difficult because you obviously set your own self-worth, don't you? By if you have a low value, then you could be seen in that space. And I think it can be really difficult then to raise prices. Equally, you don't want it too high that you're saying that you think that your pieces are that value, when in a way you're not creating work to be of a certain value. So I almost don't know what the answer to that is. And I think that's one that I've struggled a lot with in terms of trying to price pieces. And I wonder if that's probably one of the benefits of if you sell through galleries, or you're represented by an agent or a gallery, is that they kind of make those decisions for you, or at least will advise more on it. Especially when you take into consideration commissions and commission cuts and things like that. So,
of course.
But yeah, it is such an interesting topic, I think, for artists to know where they fall in that space and how to value it and how to compare it with others. And do you have a high price and hope eventually that, by saying, okay, no, my painting's worth this much, that it's almost that effect that because you've said it's that much, that people go, oh God, it must be really good then, because it's that high, versus having a lower price to get people through the door. And I don't really know what the answer is, really.
And that's cool, because that's something that you will learn as your career progresses. And that's kind of the fun thing. And not just that, like you have to make mistakes. And I think particularly when it comes to pricing, I know a lot of artists who have started off at a certain price and then they just raise it because, maybe they're getting more views. Maybe they've just done a collaboration with a really good company, and that's going to obviously boost their sales and boost their exposure and what's the word for it? Their reputation, I guess. Depends on where your reputation falls. But I also think you shouldn't undersell yourself. That's the worst thing you can do as an artist.
Yeah, it's a hard one, isn't it? And I'm so bad at it.
I think everybody is, really. I truly do. I think until you get to a certain point in your reputation and you're somebody like who can I think of that's going to be like a good example that maybe you might actually know? there's an artist called Derek Hess, whose work is really, really, really interesting. And his work is gorgeous. And his prices are actually pretty high, but the way he's established in the kind of role of his career and the amount of length of time he's been doing it for, he's been doing it for like decades. It's worth that money. I was going to say Damien Hirst, but Damien Hirst is a whole different subject. And I feel like I mention him in every single episode, so I probably shouldn't mention him. But like, I'm trying to think who's like a contemporary artist who you might know that I think is worth the money to be spent on, even though it's high. It's like a lot of street artists I see. You look at their work and they're selling prints that are like, quite simple for like hundreds of pounds. But if we think about the longevity of their careers, it makes sense because they've been doing it for a long time and their reputation allows them to do that.
And also, like, if people can afford to pay for it and they get joy out of it, and it's a really weird thing, I think, the whole concept of the value of art, because people choose to pay thousands of pounds for cars almost, and it's not even really something that's considered as something that's unusual, but yet you pay, if you bought a piece for £1,000 or something, it feels like insanely expensive. And like, what I mean? It's almost the concept of money is so strange, just in terms of how we live our lives, but also in the art space is really weird. And I suppose also because you could sell a piece for X amount, and then as your reputation grows, that piece that you sold 10 years ago could now be worth however many times it.
Yeah, that's true.
So as an artist, you don't really often see or receive the benefits financially of the work that you do.
That's true. That's very true. Particularly people are going to buy it to invest, which, you're grateful for, but it's also like, you're also kind of conscious that they're going to end up making probably more money than you did at that point.
Yeah.
So that's a good point, actually. I've never thought about it like that. See, this is one thing I love talking to people, is because I always get considerations I've never thought about. And it's nice because I always get something up every single interview I do, which is great. And this is so far been particularly great.
Good.
So do you think there are any downsides to creating your work? And do you feel like you've ever boxed yourself in by the subject matter and the themes you explore?
I don't think that, I think sometimes you can feel like I've had people ask me before, like, oh, you only paint women. Like, will you ever paint, why don't you paint men? And it's like, well, maybe I will at a point paint men. It's just that where I am at the moment in terms of my creative process and what it is that I'm looking to explore, that's the focus that I want to make with the portraits that I produce. And I think once you realize that, like everything in life, it is full of change and failures and success and ups and downs, and it's just a journey. Like, everything can change, and if you're not boxed in by it and you allow yourself that movement, things become a lot easier, I think. You could have a certain style and then completely change that. This idea of style is such a strange one, I think, because you obviously do have a look, but you could completely change how you approach something, and it might not look like your previous work, but you're still the one producing it, so it's still your style. And I think that falls into the whole, this thought of can you get boxed in by what it is that you're making? Also thinking about not being dictated by what we're told, I suppose, around what it means to be an artist and the styles that you have.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think you're right, because we go through, like, we all go through phases in life. Life is just a constant series of phases. That's all it is. The things you're interested in now weren't the things you were necessarily interested in 10 years ago or 2 years ago or a year ago. And I think we have a tendency to forget that we're not always the same people as we were. We're experiencing different things. We're in different places. We have different emotions. We have different, physical settings, and things are always, as you said, things are always in a constant change. And I think when we look at art, we assume that the image that we're assuming was painted recently, because it might not even be painted recently, you're
Yeah.
creating it from the same place as an image you painted like 10 years ago, and that's not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And not even just that, I think one of the great things about art is that art is very timeless in a way, in terms of once you put it online, it's archived. Somebody may see your work, a piece of your work now in 10 years' time, and be inspired by that. It's not just a one-time thing, it's here now and it's gone tomorrow. It may be buried into, cat videos, but it's not going to be it's still going to be there accessible at some point in the future. And I think
totally.
If we think of social media more as an archive as opposed to instantaneous, success or instantaneous popularity, I think we'd all probably put a little bit less pressure on ourselves to create more stuff and be happy with what we're doing.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, no, I agree completely.
That concludes the first part of my conversation with Ellis King. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or comments about the episode, please email me at theflyingfruitbowl@gmail.com or get in touch via social media sites such as Twitter and Instagram. The Flying Fruit Bowl podcast can now be found on a variety of sites such as Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Music. If you like the show, please consider rating, reviewing, sharing, or subscribing on any of these platforms to help spread the show. Also, don't forget to check out theflyingfruitbowl.co.uk, where we post daily art inspiration and written interviews. And if you're a creative, please get in touch for a chance to be featured or interviewed. If you'd like to support the platform further, we now also have a Patreon page. Tiers start from £1, and for more information, head on over to patreon.com/theflyingfruitbowl. If you prefer to make a one-time donation to the Flying Fruit Bowl, we also now have a PayPal. The link to the PayPal should be included in the show notes. Once again, thank you very much for listening to the episode today.